Okay, everybody, welcome back to another edition of the Orthodox Nationalist. I am Matthew Raphael Johnson, and for those of you who have not heard this show before, I am an Orthodox Old Catholic, which means that we are part of the Western Rite of the Orthodox Church. I'm a historian, and I specialize in Russian and Ukrainian history and the early Middle Ages. And I serve as a priest under the Ukrainian Greek Orthodox Church of North and South America, and we are in communion, at least as of May of 2011, with the Greek calendarists under Angelos Godavasios of Bulgaria, Unifide of Bukovina, Ukraine, and Raphael of Moscow. And so we form, as of right now, the largest traditionalist family of Orthodox churches in the world. And when I say traditionalist, I'm referring to the true Orthodox movement, those who reject Judaization, globalism, syncretism, ecumenism, and liberalism in all of its forms. Now, as a result of all of that, we are royalists, generally speaking, in terms of our politics. And on this show, I have dealt with the question of monarchy in its Russian as well as its Western European context. And I have qualified my support of monarchy and royalism in general in the sense that in order to be truly legitimate, the society that the monarch rules has to be a family. A monarch is a monarch because he is the father of a large family. Therefore, the people over which he rules has to function and act as such. But that generally suggests that the society be more or less unified in basic questions of religion, ethnicity, language, and general customs. Now that's, again, speaking very generally. No society is purely homogeneous. But what I'm trying to say here is that the only real rational monarchical principle is that it functions at the same time that the basic principles of solidarity that undergird nationalism functions. Now, in general, monarchy and nationalism has functioned together. You can think of such movements as in France, in Spain, in the Scandinavian countries, 19th century Prussia, to some extent Russia, certainly places like Serbia and Bulgaria, where the monarch has in fact been an ethnarch. And that's not a problem. Places like Russia to a great extent and Austria are kind of a different story because in Austria, the ruling house was really a minority people in terms of Germans being less than 50% of the population of the empire. And in Russia, if you exclude Ukrainians, Russians made up about 45 to 50% of the empire. If you add Ukrainians and call them Russians, it goes higher. That's kind of problematic. And that's the difference between a legitimate national monarchy on the one hand and empire on the other. We've also dealt with that on this show. Today is Mother's Day 2011, and in honor of Mother's Day, we're going to talk about monarchy, specifically the killing of the king Masonic ritual. And to some extent, there is a clear connection with the more modern idea of motherhood. And we're going to get to that in a minute. But I want to make something clear. One of the reasons that I really developed my specific concept of royalism, something more or less akin to what you might find in the Iron Guard in Romania or Franco in Spain, the concept really is that modernity, republicanism, materialism, and industrialism much of which largely unified by the banking oligarchy, is to a great extent empowered by the occult killing of the king ritual. In other words, modernity is to a great extent, and speaking in general terms, the product of the killing of the king ritual. I first came across this occult doctrine my freshman year in college when I had to read Sigmund Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents, and he actually spends a lot of time talking about this so-called primal rebellion. But it wasn't until later on when I read Elizabeth Dilling and then Sir James George Frazer in The Golden Bough when I started to understand the political content of the killing of the king ritual. And then later on I read J.S. Downard and Michael Hoffman's work on the Kennedy assassination, and slowly but surely it all came together, exactly how primal the killing of the king ritual was in the Judaic occult. Generally speaking, the killing of the king ritual is this form of consecration that marks a transition between the 32nd and 33rd degrees of Freemasonry, which, at least as far as the arch lodges of the English-speaking world are concerned, are the end of at least mainline Masonry. I know that there are other sects like Crowley's that go way beyond the 33rd degree, but we're talking about here something very foundational. How other sectarians will build on this foundation is another issue. But I want to hold first and foremost that once you come to understand what the killing of the king liturgy is, its close and tight connection to the creation of the modern world, its almost liturgical and symbolic foundation, and how that ties together with modern movements. And if you read the people who I've just mentioned, some of whom I'm going to cite now, the concept, at least in mystic terms, of modernity starts to make sense. And as I used to teach in my Renaissance class, and one of the reasons I got into so much trouble, that the Renaissance, especially the work of Bruno and Ficino, that these people were resurrecting the concept of the Kabbalistic Ein Sof. And the Ein Sof is going to be something very, very significant. I came across this concept in Elizabeth Dilling many, many years ago, and she wants to connect it to the substance with a capital S of Spinoza. I'm not entirely sure if there's a parallel there or not, but I want to say that the Ein Sof is the central concept in the Kabbalah and in Judaism in general, because the Ein Sof is pure nothingness. It is pure nothingness in the sense that it is pure chaos. It is pure chaos, and this shows up in Kant, it shows up in Nietzsche, it shows up again and again and again, and it has to be summoned. This cosmic dust, which is identical, by the way, to the primal soup of the evolutionary mythology, needs to be summoned. Chaos needs to be created. Out of this chaos comes the new world. So that's the fundament of what we call modernity, and the very apogee, the zenith of modernity, which is a new world order, which in my personal opinion is the ushering in of Antichrist at the rebuilt temple of Jerusalem. No doubt the rebuilt temple to be financed by the American taxpayer. Now, all of this is central to the concept of monarchy. Monarchy represents, at its most fundamental, the rulership of God over the earth. As God is the author and sustainer of natural law and natural laws, the earthly monarch is the author, so to speak, and the sustainer of human laws. It is a perfect pyramid from the purely spiritual world of God and his and the logos, the manifestation in nature, which is very much the activity of natural law, and of course the analog to the monarch. And this is why, generally speaking, all forms of Christianity up until the extreme Protestants, the Anabaptists and other of these very destructive and Judaic forces, were royalists. This is the case for Orthodox, Catholics, Anglicans, and Lutherans. Because this basic concept, the metaphysical concept of the monarch as representing God's power, and to some extent imitating God's power, on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the monarch as the head of the family, the monarch as ethnarch and patriarch. These two things were viewed by what we now call the regime, or the New World Order, the illumined ones, the Kabbalists, the neo-pagans, whatever you want to call them. This situation was viewed as intolerable, because the monarchy is that which restrains the oligarchy. I want to make another claim, and I know I've made this many times before on this show, but in terms of politics, and politics is a very limited area of life. There's only so much we can expect out of it. But in politics, human beings only have really one choice: either monarchy or oligarchy. There generally is no in-between. And this is the central foundational idea of the killing of the king ritual. Because the point of murdering the king, whether in a symbolic sense or in a literal sense, and all the different concepts of kingship that we might use in society, like the patriarch of a family, like the father, like Christ himself, like God the Father, like a monarch, an emperor, etc. The point of killing this center of power, this center of unity, is the summoning of chaos, and out of chaos comes the new world. In alchemical terms, you could think of the monarchy in Europe as a leaden metal, the revolutionaries as quicksilver, which then dissolves this, and in the creation of this dissolution, this chaos, they then recreate humanity into gold. Alchemy is really a social science. It's about manipulating people. And I want to make something clear, is whether you read the Bible or whether you read medieval literature or ancient literature, you need to remember that quantitative measures, numbers and, dimensions and stuff like that, always have a qualitative element. So numbers aren't just numbers. They're forms. They're forms of reality. They're qualitative aspects of reality. One is unity. One is divinity. Two is division. Two is female. We can go on and on and on about this. So no matter who you read, coming from the ancient tradition, including the occult tradition, things like numbers and dimensions and geometric figures are never just quantitative things. They are qualitative things. They are intensely powerful symbols. The killing of the king ritual is destruction of the number one. The number one is the masculine, rational, ruling figure, ruling having to do with the manifestation of the unity of natural law within society. In Orthodox terms, that is simply manifesting the rule of Logos, Christ himself, in the world. In many ways, when the Pharisees demanded of the Romans that Christ be executed, that was a Babylonian form of the killing of the king ritual. The Pharisees thought that in murdering their enemy, they would continue in power, continue in authority, continue in their wealth. All forms of the killing of the king ritual, to a great extent, partake in that initial murder of God. The killing of the king is about partaking of that king's power amongst those who have risen up in rebellion. This is central to Freud's civilization and its discontents, and it proves, at least from their point of view, my contention, that you either have monarchy as a symbol of unity or oligarchy as a symbol of controlled chaos, or I should say, the psychological use of chaos for the sake of them gaining power. And I want to make it clear that from a purely psychological point of view, chaos increases the suggestive nature of those who live within it. Chaos, revolution, warfare, these are absolutely central. During war, times of economic upheaval, people become more suggestive. People then look for somebody or some group or some institution to save them. And they're willing to sacrifice quite a bit in order to be saved. So not only do we have the summoning of chaos, the summoning of this Ein Sof, this formless matter, and Aristotle's use of the word matter, that which can be created into anything because in and of itself it is nothing. But also the use of the Ein Sof, this sense of Aristotelian matter, this nothing that could be made into anything, this raw material, is in fact also the summoning of suggestibility. Because the more the Ein Sof comes into existence, the more people are confused, the more of the old foundations are removed, the more that people are willing to do anything to have some kind of stability. So I want to make it clear that the Ein Sof, in the Kabbalistic and Babylonian and Judaic sense of the word, manifests itself in revolutionary ideology, in the modern scientific mentality, and especially the idea of the evolutionary primordial soup. I see it even in the so-called stem cell debate in America, where, of course, the stem cell, prior to it becoming a specialized worker, is very much like the Ein Sof. It's a cell that, if given the right stimulus, can become anything. Can become a cell that specializes in cardio work or in the lungs or in anything else like that. The Ein Sof, this formless matter that then the elite can mold into whatever it wants. This is chaos. This is the foundation of all revolutionary systems. The idea of dissolving everything into its component parts, and then the revolutionary elite reforming it all according to their own demands and their own desires. All revolutionary movements, all modern scientific thinking has this at its basis. But in order for any of this to function, in order for this to be taken as truth, the king must be murdered. The king must be murdered because the Christian restrainer, that which oversees the logos, the manifestation of the Platonic forms in nature, the foundation, the activity, the function of natural law, that has to be destroyed. There can't be any natural law in the scientific mentality. It has to start with a primordial soup of absolutely nothing. From that, we can then theorize as to how things came into existence. The central concept of evolution is that the evolutionary scientific establishment then can take control over this and manipulate it for their own purposes. All revolutionary ideologies use in one form or another this evolutionary concept. Capitalism does it in its analysis of feudalism and slavery. Marxism explicitly is evolutionary. Materialism and positivism is evolutionary. We start from this alienated mind which projects itself into the spiritual world. The modern revolutionary world views this as now being conjoined in a sexual and marital relation where our mind and that of the material world become one and the same thing. This may sound very esoteric, and of course it is, and yet you can't understand anything about modernity and where these various mentalities came from unless you understand that the primal struggle has to be the murder of the God who is responsible for the actual existence and functioning of natural law. Natural law does not exist. It must be created according to the mind of the revolutionaries. We will create the law. We will create what works and what doesn't, because we will also create the very system within which you think. The very building blocks of making a rational argument we have created, and that you can see everywhere. It is symbolized in the Old Testament in the Tower of Babel. It is symbolized in Judaic and Masonic lore as the two pillars of the temple. And like everything else, the Temple of Solomon itself, to be rebuilt in Jerusalem and to be inhabited by the Jewish elite as the reigning Antichrist, this is also a symbol for the new world. The Temple of Solomon is something that is designed and brought into being by the revolutionary elite, the architects who use this primal matter in order to construct their new world and their new society. So, according to James Frazer, who was really one of the first to lay out this killing of the king ritual in more or less its occult mentality, at least in its exoteric mentality, is that the murder of the king comes when that king seems to be decrepit, showing signs of age, showing signs of weakness. The sort of ontological concept here is that when the king is murdered and the soul is forcibly ripped from the body by this revolutionary cult that conspires to murder the king, that force, that power is then shared, or taken, of course, and shared amongst that revolutionary elite, sort of parceled out. The power of that monarch is taken and parceled out amongst the revolutionaries. This is also the mentality of cannibalism in almost all societies, and this is present even in the French Revolution, where the eating, and this goes back, to Babylon, the eating of the murdered king in one form or another is a means of, quite literally, partaking of this royal blood, of this royal power. And of course, in our liturgy, you see this taking place. And this takes place with Christ's glorified body, not his human body, of course, his glorified post-resurrection body. And this is something that we do to partake of Christ's divinity. Now, in this case, we're talking about a purely secular and materialist idea coming from the Babylonian Talmud, manifest in the Kabbalah, and then manifest throughout the revolutionary mentality wherever it takes place. In order to summon chaos, the king must be killed. And the concept of king is very broad. It can be the father. It can be men in general. It can be Christ. It can be God the Father. It can even be, in the normal sense, the king of a country, the patriarch of a society, whatever it might be. The priesthood in the Orthodox world, to constantly tear them down, to destroy them, to sacrifice them, to therefore partake of their power via the chaos that is then summoned. This is the modern world at its foundation. Okay, we're going to take a break now. When we return, we're going to finish this up. Okay, everybody, welcome back to the Orthodox Nationalist. In honor of Mother's Day 2011, we are dealing with the killing of the king ritual. You might wonder what the connection is, but it's central to the modern world. And when I discovered this back in college, it really is one of the many things that led me to become a monarchist. And that interest in monarchy is what got me involved in this field, and 20 years later, here I am. Like I said before, I first came across this when I read Freud's Civilization and its Discontents, and there is a substantial section in there about this primal rebellion that, according to Freud, is at the very root of human nature. It is a fanciful understanding, although with very literal and very real effects, of the concept of revolution. For Freud, the killing of the king, the killing of the god, the killing of the father, the killing of the male as patriarch, these are all the same thing. It's no accident that the Frankfurt School, who was overwhelmingly Jewish, took Freud, a Kabbalistic Jew, and Marx, another Jew, and synthesized them together to create what we kind of call that sexualized Marxism. And all the major members of the Frankfurt School, led by Herbert Marcuse, San Diego State University, who was financed almost exclusively by the Rockefeller Foundation. If you look at the preface of any of his books, it says so right in there. Thank you for the generous grant from the Rockefeller Foundation to fight capitalism and patriarchy. But this is at the root of revolution. The killing of the king is seen not merely as an act of violence and rebellion, nihilism and the end self are really one and the same thing, but it is a sacrifice. The concept of sacrifice is something that shows up again and again in the occult mentality. I read about it first of all in James Frazier. I read about it in the great Elizabeth Dilling. I read about it in J.S. Downard and Michael Hoffman. I read about it in E. Michael Jones. And it took a while. This isn't something that you kind of grasp right away. But it took a while for all of this to gel in my mind relative to the idea of the modern revolution. When I say the modern revolution, I'm talking about the creation of republics out of monarchies. And all republics are based on the concept of oligarchy. So when you murder the king, in the sense of Cromwell's murder of Charles I, of the French revolutionaries' murder of Louis Capet, or the Soviet murder of Nicholas II. We can go on and on and on. The judicial murder of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. We can continue to go on. This is meant to be a ritualized form, the killing of that which restrains chaos, and then that use of chaos to remake the world in the interests of those who have conspired to kill the king. This is the genesis of republicanism as it arose in North Italy, in Novgorod in Russia, in North Germany, the Hanseatic cities, of which Novgorod was the largest, and to a great extent of modern America. So this is a partaking in some sense of the Pharisaic and Talmudic murder of Christ. Its symbolic purpose is to go even further back and to partake in the primal murder of the Father for the sake of the empowerment of the Son. What we mean here is that these people are partaking in the ancient fertility ritual. The king, according to James Frazier, cannot show any signs of weakness. Once the center of power shows signs of weakness, what's left of that power must be shared amongst those who are willing to take over. And it should be noted that in many cases, and Fraser goes all over the world, from Africa to Thailand, and talks about parallel expressions of this idea, that those who take over because they have now shared in this power. They have absorbed, in some cases literally absorbed, the blood and the flesh and the soul of the murdered king, represent the most vigorous elements of society, like the capitalist class or the Soviet ruling class in the early years of the revolution, and as a result of this have to be obeyed without question. Now, this is, in a certain sense, mirrored in the sacrifice of the firstborn boy, by the way, of the worship of Baal and Moloch in the Middle East. Now, this was done in two places. The two great trading cities of the Phoenicians, Tyre, which is condemned in absolutely no uncertain terms by Ezekiel and Isaiah. This was sort of the New York of its day. And Carthage, which was another major trading city, which was a Phoenician colony, and a colony of Tyre. Now, these trading cities, and we could say, London, we could say Tyre, we could say Carthage, we could say New York, we could say Venice, etc. They all have a few things in common. These are all republics, okay, and the monarchy in Britain has no power, so that's a republic. These are republics. These are oligarchies. In other words, they're ruled by the rich. These are places that love to talk about how democratic they are, that there's a legal equality, but that's just a sham because the only thing that matters is money. So there's no equality, legal or not, regardless of what a piece of paper might say or a political ideology might say. And these societies, at least at one point in their existence, believed that they were sustained in their tremendous in wealth and money and power by human sacrifice. In the British case, it was the ritual murder of Charles I. But in places like Tyre and Carthage, it was the ritual murder of the firstborn to please either Baal or Moloch. Baal is a title. It simply means overlord, but it's overlord in the sense of property owner. It's an economic category. Baal is overlord because this overlord possesses property, possesses money, possesses power. So in many ways, it's a form of the mentality of the elite of the era. Moloch is one of the infernal names, very familiar to Satanists, and it's actually a specific person. Moloch is the god of human sacrifice, and as a result, the god of abortion. I know some people think that Lilith is the god of abortion, a goddess of abortion. Lilith in the Talmud is a demon that provokes men to sexual lust, and when they masturbate, she takes that semen and then goes and impregnates women to form other demons. That's in the Talmud. And the result of this is that she has kind of gotten the reputation being the goddess of abortion. But I don't think that's the case, because these half demon, half humans are meant to be born and are meant to rule. So Lilith, which is, by the way, one of the favorites of the system, as you remember back in the 90s, there was a Warner Brothers Records had put on this all-female concert tour called Lilith Fair, and it was really a ritualized worship of this kind of the domination of the male by the Jewish, or by the Talmud, or by this female demon. And this female demon controls men by controlling their sex drive. Now, and of course, there's no better way to control a man than to control his sex drive. Not only to control his sex drive, but to control the access to those kinds of things. The creation of the sexual revolution that made it possible and permissible and easy for men to satisfy themselves in this way. So it is a form of control, and of course, the worship of Lilith that you find in the Talmud is connected to this idea of the killing of the king, because Lilith is, number one, female, and number two, does control males through the sex drive. So this is the use of sex and the female body as a weapon, and Lilith has a tendency to be the sort of the personification of this in Talmudic and general demonology. The more specific idea, though, is that you can't have the sexual revolution without abortion. Because if you don't have abortion, you're going to have all of these unwanted kids. And so the result of this is the use of abortion quite literally as a Talmudic and pagan sacrifice. And so in the major trading cities of the world, and specifically Tyre, Carthage, and really their mother, which is Babylon, the murder of the firstborn male was meant to ensure peace and prosperity for those who remain. And that, and I first came across this in Michael Hoffman back in grad school, that is really the sacramental element of abortion in the occult world, because the overwhelming majority of abortions, even by Planned Parenthood's own admission, are based on convenience. It's about, I need to go to work, I can't have a baby now, I need to maintain my figure, I can't have a baby now, my boyfriend would be angry, I can't have a baby now. And so it's the exact same thing. You sacrifice this child, and the result is that you get something very positive in return. The origins of this, of course, are purely Talmudic and part of the occult mentality. And the blood from this sacrifice was, at least in some places, sprinkled on people as a form of baptism. And this, in the Masonic world, is the passage to the 33rd degree. Remember, the firstborn, in at least the Hebrew tradition, is the future patriarch of the family. So the firstborn male is really a type of Christ. Christ, one of Christ's many titles, is the firstborn of the dead after he rose from the dead. So the idea of the murder of the firstborn male is central to the killing of the king ritual, because this firstborn male will himself, by virtue of that fact, become patriarch of the family. And the sacrifice also, and this is with James Shelby Downard, is the form of a scapegoat. The king is murdered as a way to release the passions of those who believe to be themselves mistreated by him. But this scapegoat, the Greek word for this in Downard's work is pharmakos. We get the word pharmacy from it. It's this combination of drugs and magic in the creation of an ecstatic state that to some extent is represented by the color red. And to some extent, the connection between drugs and revolution in the 20th century have been fairly clear, because both the CIA and the KGB, especially in Khrushchev's era, did tremendous experimentation in drugs and the use of drugs to help, at least in a symbolic sense, resurrect the Ein Sof, or chaos from which anything and everything can be made. But in our day, the killing of the king ritual is, in fact, fairly obvious in almost every aspect of life. I think that in early industrialism, the use of child labor, the use of really any kind of labor, in the necessity of the early factory work was the sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of lives for the sake of the coming new world. Remember, industrialism is based on the creation of what the elite want to see out of the chaos of the Ein Sof. Industrialism is the negation of natural law. It is not the working with natural law. It is the replacement of natural law with machines. So, we're talking about the replacement of nature with the mentality of the elite. In order to do this, millions have to be sacrificed. Factory labor alone in early industrialism sacrificed tens of thousands of kids, and this is considered legitimate. We love our cars and motorcycles, and clearly I don't know how many millions have been killed in traffic accidents since the mass production of the automobile, but that also is considered an acceptable price to pay for what we gain out of this technology. For any aspect of technology, there is a sacrifice. For anything that exists, there must be a shadow. For any action, there must be an equal and opposite reaction. When you create a car, you can talk about how wonderful it is, and then let people learn later on how many people have to die for this to be enjoyed. Any development of technology even the development of things like antibiotics have the unintended result of weakening the body's immune system. So there's no progress in technology that doesn't have its negative side. The very existence of the mass weaponry of World War I and World War II itself proves that science is in no position to lecture anybody in questions of morality and progress, because everything from the atom bomb to napalm to carpet bombing to the machine gun to poison gas, everything is based on some very important scientific technology. These are considered acceptable sacrifices for the new world that science is going to create. That had its initial symbol in the sacrifice of children to Moloch and Baal in Phoenicia, in Carthage, and for the most part in ancient Israel. The ancient Israelites did this all the time, and this is why the prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel rose up, because their purpose was to condemn these things. The prophets condemned Israel in no uncertain terms for the most part, Israelite life, with some exceptions, like the reign of King Josiah and people like that. This was essentially a pagan society. The prophets came into existence and were called to condemn this. They almost all were murdered. And when Christ condemned the Pharisees, he said, "You have murdered the prophets, you will now murder me." This also is about the killing of the true king. The killing of the kings, or in some cases the killing of the prophets, which in many ways they were true patriarchs. This was a way to continue the rule of the elite, the Pharisaical pagan elite, whether it be in ancient Israel or Judah, before they were known as Pharisees, all the way up to the modern New World Order. It's the same thing. We could talk about abortion or industrial accidents or early industrialization or constant warfare. The killing of the king is of central importance. And this can be seen, I think, in Iraq, where you had a very good man in Saddam Hussein, a man who really was on the verge of creating a first world society and a first world economy, needed to be killed with the very flimsy legal idea of one massacre that he allegedly committed in western Iraq years ago. But of course, the IDF gets American tax money. They do the exact same thing all the time. The killing of the king ritual was designed, in this relatively small case, to produce chaos in Iraq. And at the very least, that energy, that power will go to Israel, who then is now safe from what would have been the first world modern industrialized power in the Middle East, which Saddam Hussein was in the midst of creating. And that little fact isn't talked about very much, but economic growth and the reinvestment of the oil wealth was something that was a regular occurrence both in Libya and in Iraq. And both of the killings, whether real or symbolic, of these leaders has everything to do with Israel and Tel Aviv and the IDF taking this power to themselves and using it to rule with even greater force to everybody around it. But that's not all. Of course, The killing of the king is everywhere. It's about the destruction of all forms of patriarchy, whether it be the firstborn male, or the king, or Christ, or a strong male leader, or the father of the family. It's all considered one and the same thing. Feminism, which has very strong Jewish roots, came into existence for this very same mentality, the killing of patriarchy. I have read in collegiate newspapers, all collegiate newspapers, by the way, are controlled by the administration. They're essentially state papers, where feminist groups on campus have burned a male, kind of a generic man, in effigy. People like Fraser make it clear that the burning of effigy for the sake of the symbolic killing of the king was very common in ancient societies, globally speaking. Destruction of monarchy, priesthood, and fatherhood are all one and the same. It's the creation of chaos. The feminist attacks on the family, industrialism, and banking, the slow consolidation of the Pharisaical elite, which is the Antichrist prophesied in the Bible, the killing of the prophets, the killing of maleness in its traditional European sense, all of this is an aspect of the killing of the king, to destroy all concept of natural authority and to put in its place the machines, the ideology of the super elite in the creation of the Antichrist rebuilt Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. The rebuilt Temple of Solomon, as I said, is a symbol for the rebuilding of the world. Remember, all of these quantitative things, whether it be in mathematics or science or architecture, all of these quantitative things expressed in numbers and formula and angles and geometric figures and all this, these are qualitative. These are ideological and philosophical concepts in addition to them being merely quantitative numbers and scientific ideas. So I want to conclude here, and I want to conclude by saying that without patriarchy, God the Father, monarchy on earth, patriarchy at the local level and at the family level, without that, those are the bulwarks of natural law. Antichrist is based on the idea of rejecting all forms of natural law and ruling by machinery, which does not work with natural law as sort of the ancient and the medieval technology did. It worked with the forces of nature. This seeks to replace the forces of nature, all of which to be controlled by really a handful of powerful central computers dominated by a handful of people. This is the utopia of the scientific revolution. This is a utopia of Francis Bacon, of the Kabbalah, of the occult concept of industrialization. And the summoning of the Ein Sof is absolutely at the root of it, because the summoning of the Ein Sof is the summoning of that which has no law. Law will then be imputed to it by the elite. It is the replacement of God by the Kabbalistic elite and their hangers-on. I'm going to stop now. This is really just a very brief thumbnail, sketch outline of this topic. This topic is huge. This is really just probing the perimeters of an immense topic that lies at the root of everything we call modern and industrial. And in coming to understand these occult doctrines, I then slowly began to convert to the medieval and royalist and agrarian way of life. And I think that what I've kind of uttered here now, to a great extent, summarizes a lot of what I've done on this show, and makes sense out of everything that I've said, whether it be in the medieval, Russian, Ukrainian, and the Orthodox, patristic, and philosophical world. And I hope that's clear. If not, we're going to continue to build on this topic in coming weeks. And so I want to thank you for listening, and I will talk to you next time. Bye-bye.